Hello and welcome. My name is Andreas Kühne and this is my course, The Foundations and Clinical Applications of Classical Chinese Medicine. Thank you for joining the program. I'm really looking forward to work with you. This is a 2-year course and we will have a 90-minute study video each month, plus a 60-minute video with questions and answers. To send questions in, please use my email questions@andreas-kühne.com. The premium members, please also use the study group on Facebook. You get an invite sent to your email. The Premium Plus members, please arrange your personal study time with me on Skype. I'm ready, I'm excited, I hope you too. Let's begin. So, hello again to the course. The Foundations and Clinical Applications of Classical Chinese Medicine. As you already know, this is a 24-module course and this is the first module, so welcome to it. Before we go into the main topics of the Foundations of Chinese Medicine, we are gonna talk a bit about the conceptual difference between Western medicine and Chinese medicine in general. That's very important because in order to understand all the differing aspects of classical Chinese medicine, it's always good and proved really necessary to understand the main difference from these two distinct systems and also a bit about how they developed in time. So our first question is what the conceptual difference between Western medicine and classical Chinese medicine. Western medicine in general is a causal analytical philosophy. That is the background of it. That's the superstructure, if you want. And a causal analytical philosophy leads to a causal analytical science approach. And within this science approach, we have also a causal analytical medical approach then. What does that all mean? That means that from a Western medicine point of view, we are describing the human being and we're explaining it by its objective structure. Meaning all the metabolic functions, all processes, everything what interests us are causal derivations from this structure. So the main medical foundation, therefore, is anatomy and physiology. How does that work in practice? If you have a physical background, if you have a anatomy and physiology as a background, if your approach is causal analytic, then your diagnosis tries to establish medical evidence, like a physical medical evidence, by comparing the patient tangible data with a defined standard. So it's a technique of comparing two sets of data. And obviously in Western medicine, the defined standard develops in time and gets updated. But in the moment we are in, we have a certain defined standard that we use to compare the patient data. So, and this derivation from a defined standard in a causal relation to a patient's problem, that is the disease from Western medicine point of view. So, basically, Western medicine will look how does a patient differs, how does it differ in its structure from the defined standard. And he does that in many ways. So we use X-ray, we use laboratory, we use CT. So we use anything where we can, in Western sense, where we can get tangible data, where we can create a physical, structural picture of the patient. And in finding this difference, where when I have a problem, let's say I have a pain, then Western medicine tries to find out what is the structural evidence of that pain. What is different? What is maybe something broken? Maybe something is off some normal defined standard. Maybe is there something. In the end, there's always a question: is there something too much of something? Is there something too little of something? Is it on the wrong position? So we look for structural aspect of it. And if we get this evidence, then we have the diagnosis in Western medicine, and the treatment can start. The treatment aims to change the patient's structural situation according to the latest standards. And in changing the patient's structural situation, it is a change expected in the disease causality. Meaning, if we, for example, find that there is some aspect in our molecular structure missing, we can add it, then the process works again. Or if we don't have enough vitamins, we can add them and the process can work. Or if we have, let's say, a pathological aspect which just doesn't belong there, let's say a bacteria, we can take it away and the process can work again. So it's a question of finding out the structural situation on many levels of the patient and changing it again to the wanted structural situation. We expect then that all the processes function nicely. And that it's a very unique system, obviously, and the whole thing is not about what is better, Western medicine or Chinese medicine. It's just to know that any system is unique, and Western medicine and Chinese medicine have their own strength and weaknesses and limits. And if you know your system well enough and you know your possibilities and your limits, then you can be good at it, obviously. So there's never the question about what system is better. It always depends on how good you're in it and how good you're using it and when and how you're using it. So we're not going into all the ideas about what is better than the other, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. The important what we need to find out is that we understand the difference of it, because understanding the difference and understanding the system itself, that makes us aware of exactly the limits and possibilities, and we can develop the system, we can enhance this, we can use it in the best way. So obviously Western medicine, if you want an example, in, for example, acute cases, acute diseases, especially traumatic diseases, for example, it's an extremely good system then, because you can very fast use your data, how something should be structurally, and maybe then reshape it into the way it was or you want it to be. So in acute traumatic diseases, like accidents, Western medicine and our culture is the way we go. And the maybe challenge of is when we have a very chronic disease and we don't have a very clear, tangible evidence. With very chronic diseases, sometimes there is no clear disease causality, because obviously the more chronic a disease gets, the more important are the individual conditional factors. So in that case, sometimes the approach of Western medicine is limited. And in Chinese medicine, there are other strengths and weaknesses, what we will go into later when we're there. So anyway, about discussing what is better, as I said before, that we don't want to go into that because that doesn't make any sense. But it is, in the end, it's a cultural question. It's not a medical question. So a certain culture, has expectations and views. What is health? What is disease? And what is a culture expecting from a medical system? So in the end, what I use and how much I use a medical system is more a cultural question than a medical question. So people have to be satisfied with certain outcomes and to have certain expectations met. Let's have a look to the Chinese aspect. Classical Chinese medicine in general is a conditional philosophy, and it leads to a conditional science and also creates a conditional medical approach then. That means that the human being is understood as a functional system, changing by connecting with and disconnecting from its environment. So it's basically in a constant flux and a constant change of adaptation. The system is explained through its functions and their relations to the individual conditional framework. Other than in Western medicine, there's no distinction or hierarchy between substance and process or function. So substance and process is always on the same level. That means the classical Chinese medicine will not describe the human by its manifestation, by its structure, like Western medicine, which would be describing something more by its disconnection from the environment, which is obviously the point of view of Western medicine, and there it needs to be very accurate. But in Chinese medicine, we use a different way to look at something. We try to describe something in its relation between connection and disconnection. So we actually use the environment to describe the human. We describe the single aspect by connecting it to a conditional framework again. So the medical foundation is this concurrency of connection and disconnection, of being and not being, which is yin and yang in the end, and the relations of connection, disconnection in its unbecoming and becoming process in relation to the conditional framework. That sounds probably all very complicated now, but we will all explain that really nicely later. It's just we have to kind of go from a very broad perspective and then go more detailed. So the main point, again, of classical Chinese medicine is that we take something, the human or even the flower or animal, anything we want to describe, and the perspective of classical Chinese medicine is to describe something by bringing it into the relation of the conditions under which it exists. So anything is existing because certain conditions are there. And in using these conditions, we can explain and show the process of a certain system. To give you a very simple example, would be, for example, you could have a snowflake on your windowsill, for example. And then you could go there and could use a snowflake and could explain it from the Western point of view. By Western point of view, you would explain the snowflake by its disconnection from the environment. You would take it apart. You could say it's made of water, and you could explain what water is in a chemical sense, and then you could explain all the building blocks of atoms there, and you could really go deeper and deeper and deeper and explain every connection with another, every disconnection, every part with another part in it. You basically you break it apart in parts and subparts. Or you could use the classical Chinese approach, and you could say, okay, snowflake, there are certain conditions that need to be there that we have that snowflake, also certain temperature, certain moistness, certain pressure, certain factors. And you would understand from that point of view that, for example, if, let's say, the temperature would rise, the snowflake would change into a drop of water. So in that way, you would understand, okay, this entity, this snowflake, this thing is only relatively stable. Because the stability depends on the stability of the conditions. So in the end, the snowflake in its being is not absolute. It's in the end, it's a process. And when certain conditions are stable enough, then the snowflake can be stable. But if you change the conditions, the snowflake will change too. And that's the Chinese medicine approach with disease. So we can have a look here. How does it work? That means that we diagnose from classical Chinese medicine point of view, we seek to connect a dysfunctional process. Yeah, that's when someone comes in and says, I have a pain, or I don't feel good, or I feel tired, or anything. Any complaint in the end is a dysfunctional process. So we seek to connect the dysfunctional process with the relevant conditions, and that obviously needs then time and learning to know what conditions are relevant and which not. So we connect the dysfunctional process with relevant conditions, internally and externally, and establish a so-called conditional pattern. So the main question is, which conditions make that process possible? Yeah, also, what are the conditions, the relevant conditions, that need to be there to make this process, in this case also the dysfunctional process, possible? And if I find that, then I have my pattern. And that is the basis for treatment in Chinese medicine. So I would understand that this disease causality, being a process, is relative. Like with the snowflake I said earlier. So it's relative and directly depending on the individual conditional framework. So very roughly spoken, the main conditional framework aspects are the personal constitution, it's the emotional dynamics, it would be the lifestyle, eating habits, sleeping habits, activity, all these things, and the outside influences, being socially, climately, everything. But as I said, I have to in a diagnosis, I have to find out the relevant conditions for this dysfunctional process I'm interested in. So the treatment then, as again like with a snowflake, I would try to change the relevant conditions for this specific disease causality in order to allow a healthy process to develop, meaning in changing the conditions, I will change the process. But that takes time sometimes, depending on how stable or relatively stable the process already is in relation to certain conditions. And that's why in Chinese medicine, you will also learn to stimulate the actual process to adapt faster to the now corrected conditions. So we have two aspects in treatment. We have the change of the conditions and the stimulation of the disease process. So it changes from being a diseased process into a healthy process. In the end, we have to stimulate the process. That's a very general concept, because any system, if you want to change any system, it's always easier to change something if it's more in a flow, if it's more active anyway. So that's why, for example, yesterday I had a client, and this client, he actually came because he had an eye problem. So he has a degeneration of a certain layer in his eye, and which is a Western diagnosis. So he came with a Western diagnosis. He came in and said, "Oh, I have this disease," and which is a defined thing. They obviously had a good look at him, and they diagnosed tangible data. They saw that this layer, this tissue on this eye is degenerating, in a comparison with the eye from his age, what would be there normally is deteriorating. So that's why there's a clear Western diagnosis. And from a Chinese point of view, obviously, I will look for what are the conditions this person is living under that this process happen. So basically, which conditions make the process of degeneration possible. So obviously, when you look from the Chinese point of view, you wouldn't actually know that there's a degeneration of this layer. It's just an information I get from Western medicine, and I can't rely on this information alone. So I basically go for my own diagnosis, in the sense that I use the description of the process. But that's what the client provides. He obviously says he can't look so good anymore, and he describes it then in very detail. He says, when does he feel he can look better? Let's say in the morning, and then in the evening can... Yeah, so there are many, many factors, what you asked, to get your situation, your disease causality described. And then you obviously use all the other factors. You use your own inspection of tongue and face and all the other aspects what we're going to learn. But my example, I wanted just to explain that the point what I want to explain is that he came in with this diagnosis, Western diagnosis, and obviously I had to discriminate a Chinese pattern in the end. But the example I was trying to say is that I was teaching him an exercise, a stretching exercise. And also he was getting herbal medicine. So his question obviously was, why do you teach me in stretching exercise? What's that to do with anything with my eye problem? Because for him, for his point of view, being in a Western thinking frame, he obviously knew his Western diagnosis and knew that he has this degeneration and he wanted to get something. No? So his attitude was very Western. It was, I lack something, this tissue, and I want to get it. So he probably thought, so I get some herbs, and they're like nice things in, and then this tissue will regenerate. So it's a typical attitude. You know? I want to get something physically. So he obviously was asking me, why should I do this exercise? And the thing is, if you just show him the exercise, here, do that exercise, and here's your herbs, and then go home, he will not be very motivated to do the exercise because he doesn't see the point. He doesn't understand the connection of the exercise to his problem. So in understanding properly from the classical Chinese point of view, you need to then, obviously you can't teach a client all this understanding, but you need to use your understanding to explain it well enough so the client is motivated enough to do the exercise. And why did I teach the exercise anyway? Because if I just give him a formula nourishing some deficiency, for example, let's say it's a Shu deficiency, and I give him some herbal formula, I kind of changing conditions. Yeah? But with the exercise I want him to do, the stretching exercise, I want him to stimulate his own system. I want to stimulate his process. I want to make his system more and easier, adaptable to the changings in the conditions we are attempting. Not just with the herbs, also with changing in his food, in his diet, and in his lifestyle. But the exercise is a key aspect, because from Chinese point of view, any problem in the end is a stagnation, of course. So we need this exercise to stimulate his process, and then the herbs will work better, the food he then eat will work better, and all the other factors he's might and hopefully change will work better. So that's why the exercise is a key element in helping his process to adapt faster, and not just faster, even better and more efficient. And sometimes it wouldn't even adapt if you wouldn't stimulate it to the corrected conditions. That's why exercises, talking of medical Chinese exercises, are very, very important in treating chronic cases. So that is an example to understand what it means to, on one hand, Chinese medicine treatment attitude is to change the relevant conditions, and secondly, stimulate the actual process. Of course, you can also stimulate the process with acupuncture, with Tuina massage, but acupuncture and Tuina massage come from the outside, so they stimulate from the outside, and which then the bodily system can take as a stimulus and do something with it. But in doing an exercise is, in the end, very, very much more strong in changing your system. So, now, in having compared these two basic approaches to medicine, Western and the Chinese way to look at it, we have a basic idea about it. So we know that Western medicine, in a nutshell, is more a causal analytic system, and Chinese medicine is more a conditional system. And that's why it's very important, if you work with Chinese medicine, that you understand you can't import diagnosis from Western medicine and just use them right away for your Chinese diagnosis. As I said earlier with this example with the person with this eye problem, obviously for communication reasons, the Western diagnosis is important because we have a culture where we strongly think in a causal analytical sense. But to do your Chinese pattern diagnosis, you need to do it from the beginning, from the start again. You can't just incorporate the Western diagnosis into it. That is a very important thing to keep in mind. Furthermore, in better understanding these two systems, I always find it very, very good to know a little bit about the history about the development of these two systems. Because people ask me then always, why do you talk about the history? Why is that important? Because it's important to understand why we are thinking now as we're thinking now. So the historic, understanding certain historic events, we understand better why we think now. Yeah? And we need to understand our client in order to help him. Chinese medicine is very much about teaching something. Because when you work, like I said, you change conditions. You can't change the condition for a client. The client has to change the conditions himself. And why would he do that? A client will only change conditions if he understands, if he sees the connection and the relevance to his problem. So a lot of the treatment is actually teaching. Obviously, in a very acute scenario, you don't teach a lot, you just do something. And as I said again, in our Western society, in a very, very acute situation, there will be the Western medicine there first in most cases anyway. So that leaves the Chinese medicine practitioners often with very chronic cases. And again, the situation in getting results when you work with Chinese medicine is not just in how you do your acupuncture, how you select the right herbal formula, or you do a nice twin arm massage. That's all extremely important, obviously. But it's as important as the conditional changes. And as I said, in order to get your client to change certain conditions, he needs not just to trust you, he also has to get some understanding how and why these conditions are relevant for him, for his problem. So, coming back to the history aspects, we need a certain understanding of historic events to understand why people think today as they do. Because if you understand why people think and how, then you can connect with them and know where to pick them up from, basically. Yeah, so it's for the communication with the client and to achieve motivation in changing conditions. That's why we need some ideas. You don't need too much, but some ideas about historic events. So there are certain events that are important from when we look at Chinese development of Chinese medicine, and there are certain events that are important to look at for the European and then the worldwide development. So maybe first we look at historic events in Europe influencing Western medicine. And obviously these are just like example, but key aspects that I think are very important. First, let's start when we go back in time. Then in the ancient Greek society, there was a cultural and philosophical background which was basically strongly influenced by polytheistic religion. So that why is that important? That is important because if you live in a culture where you have a polytheistic background or a superstructure, then you're used to deal with the idea that there are many answers to a question, not just one. Because in a polytheistic religion superstructure, we have many gods, and from the point of view of the human, then the gods, if you're religious, gods are on a different hierarchy, and if they have many opinions to a situation, that leaves you as a human with a concept of, okay, there are many opinions, there are many ideas, there are many answers to a question. There's not just one truth, because the gods are not speaking. They're not speaking with one voice. They can like have opposite positions to a situation or to a question. I don't want to go into the religion because it's not important. Important is just what cultural, philosophical effect it has on a person. The effect is, again, that you kind of used to live, you're used to think about truth in this kind of way, that you know there are many answers to a question, that they might be all true. And it's not about deciding between two or more. It's not about, if that is true, that must be false. So you kind of can live with the idea, with the concept that two opposite things could be right at the same time, depending on the viewpoint. There we come again to the condition aspect. So that's a very important aspect, this polytheistic background, the idea, the feeling that you kind of used to live under the consciousness that there could be many truths at the same time. You don't have to decide between black and white. Yeah? And this background was there in Europe, in the ancient Greek society. And one of the philosophers was Heraclit. He was around 500 BC. And he kind of taught the philosophy of a flowing relative reality. So he would like describe reality more as a river, like which is in a constant flow and change. And like a certain situation, a certain manifestation would be like a wave just standing out for a certain amount of time, but then it changes again. So the manifestation of our reality is just the manifestation like a wave in one moment in the river. So he was more a conditional kind of guy. Also he would like, it has a lot of similarities with the Chinese, classical Chinese point of view. And there's even this saying, what is from the old Greek language, pantarai, means everything is in the constant flow. This is one of his key teachings. So that is in one very interesting aspect which was there. And then we have Aristotle, which is he was kind of around 350 BC, and he was a philosopher that more described reality in its manifestation. So much more like what we do in Western medicine, Western causal analytical science today. So he would like take the same maybe river, but he would describe a certain waveform at a certain time, and would take that as a manifestation and as would describe something through the manifestation and not through the flowing aspect of it. So these two concepts were both existing in the ancient Greek society, but it wasn't that there was no big decision between which one is the better one. It was obviously there are lots of dispute, but it was a kind of even these two systems existed together, and the situation could be looked at with both systems. Yeah, So, for example, these two aspects were deeply involved in all the cultural and scientific developments in that time. But neither of one was too dominant. Yeah, you could say that. And a change came when the Roman Republic was developing around 510 BC. And the Romans initially adopted the Greek polytheistic background. I mean, no, they changed Zeus into Jupiter, so they changed the names for the gods, but they basically took over, they adopted this polytheistic system. And it's no wonder, by the way, that such a system where you have like this many truths concept also creates democratic aspects in the end, because in the end, democracy, the idea of democracy is that you have a dividing of power, that you don't have one power point, so that you divide the power between the many. And this obviously is easier to develop if you think anyway that the truth is divided. So there's a big connection between this philosophy of many truths and democracy. And so the Romans started out as a republic with a senate and stuff, so they had the division of power, and it was normal in their point of view because they were developing under this influence of the Greek polytheistic superstructure. But then was an important event in the Roman history that on the 13th of January in the year 27 BC, the Roman Republic transformed into an empire. So the dividing of power with the Senate stopped, and we have now an emperor who has a single power. So his word suddenly, his truth, so to speak, counts more, weighs more than the one of other people. So that was an important step, if you want, into the direction of a causal analytic development in Europe. Let's have a look to the next picture. And the Romans developed on from this change to an empire, and when the influences from outside countries and the problems within Rome, because Rome became bigger and bigger and bigger, were getting stronger. The empire basically was lacking certain power because of this polytheistic background. Yeah, because you have to imagine that if you're an emperor, but you have a polytheistic background, then who made you an emperor? Because it wasn't, in the end, it wasn't a democratic thing anymore. So it got inherited. Yeah. So, but where does he pull his power from? So an emperor could say, okay, I'm basically initiated by Mars. Yeah, so God Mars is my patron. But then you could have like some other guy with influence and power and money and soldiers would say, no, I'm the emperor. I'm the real emperor because I was put in charge by, let's say, Jupiter. And then it could be the next one who says, no, I should be the right emperor because I put in power by Poseidon. So the polytheistic background made it harder for one emperor to ask or explain his sole power demand. And that's why when the emperors got weaker, they tried to change that and try to help to consolidate their power again. And in the year 325, Imperator Constantine adopted a monotheistic religion as state religion. So, and he probably didn't do that out of like nice feeling for the Christians. He probably just looked, what monotheistic religion is there for me to use? And the Christians are being very young there, and they were just the right people at the right time. So, but in adopting a monotheistic religion as a state religion, there's only one God suddenly. So all these arguments about what God basically put what emperor in charge was gone. So he could just say, I'm the imperator, I'm the emperor, I am there because of God's will, and because there's only one God suddenly, no one else could claim my God put me in charge too. So he created a connection, as Constantine did, a connection between the emperor aspect, the power point of the emperor, and the legitimation of it. So how legit is an emperor in relation to the higher system, the higher hierarchy. So in being suddenly a monotheistic background, the one God system consolidated the power of the emperor in that sense. Yeah, so that's a very important concept we have to understand. This is a very, very strong point in our history in Europe. It's an extremely important point to understand. So how the change from a polytheistic, and now as I say, the religion, it's not the important aspect. It's the philosophy what makes the difference here. But that's why I say the philosophy of many truths changed into a philosophy of one truth. And that is the main, one of the main points in history where it changes very strongly into the direction, development towards a dominance of causal analytic science in Europe. So around 529, the Roman Empire decays and leaves a very globalized Europe, because the Romans connected the European countries a lot. And they started to specialize countries. So there were countries that were mainly producing wool, others were mainly producing wheat, and other maybe wood or something. So then these Roman Empire broke down and then left all these connected countries without a proper coordination and infrastructure. So this specialization was then suddenly a problem because the connection between them didn't function anymore. Yeah, that's why the infrastructure was broken and the control of it as well. And the social and economic needs that the people had were not met by the power structures following the Romans, because they were basically coming from a completely different cultural background. And so it was a kind of a historic downfall of society. And there were a lot of resulting problems in all areas of life. And that's why we call the medieval times also the Dark Ages. That's not because it was dark, it was because there were so many problems. And there were problems in law and in supplies with food and disease and the whole social organizations, basically. And because the countries were connected by the Romans in a very specific sense, and then left without the infrastructure, the problems in the medieval times were so great. So they had a lot of people with a lot of economical problems, also hunger and disease, and education and everything. So the need to compensate, the need to change that was very big. Excuse me. And that's why I always say the conditions that develop there and the necessities to move development towards causal analytic solutions were very, very much there. It's very understandable, you could say. It's a very, also when the, as I say, when the problems were so as they are, with the conditions as they are, it made sense at that time to resolve problems in that kind of way, what led to industrialized solutions, because you can meet many needs at in one grasp, basically. That's the very important reason to understand why Europe suddenly went into such a speedy development of industrialized solutions. If the Romans wouldn't have decayed, then it might have maybe stretched the development of causal analytic dominance maybe much longer, or change it all at once, or in general. But anyway, so we have that fact to understand, and because of these dark ages, as I said, and this need to change that, that's why the Renaissance developed. And interesting enough, the Renaissance, the main idea of the Renaissance was to bring back to bring back ideas and concepts of the antique, of the ancient times, of where it was better once already. Yeah, so bringing back concepts from the ancient Greek philosophy, from the ancient Roman philosophy. That was the idea of the Renaissance. Bring back stuff. It's maybe not so easy to understand today, because we are right now, like 2017, we are experiencing for years now a constant. Everything gets faster and newer, and everything, the new seems to be better. But at that time, the new was not the better. So in the Middle Ages, people had a kind of feeling that it was better once and now it's bad or worse. That's why people wanted to bring back the old. Yeah, today we often don't want to bring back the old. We kind of look for the new. But anyway, so bringing back the old, and that's why the Renaissance was the renaissance of old concepts, of better concepts. That led to the so-called Age of Enlightenment between 1650 and 1800. And it's also very understandable why that happened, because this Age of Enlightenment basically was to shed all the aspects that were not true from their point of view. So, yeah, again, not the many truths idea. It was about deciding between that is true, that is not true, that is real, that is not real. So superstition, was thrown out because of what was not true, but we wanted to have a more objective way of thinking. So objectiveness was a big thing in that Age of Enlightenment. Obviously, from philosophy point of view, could argue that every objectiveness obviously is subjectiveness. Yeah, but in that time, that wasn't the idea. The idea was there is an objectiveness there, and we as the conscious, we just as the observer, we just observe the objectiveness. The connection between observer and object wasn't as developed then as it is today, and it was in the ancient times. But in that time, there was the main idea that reality has an objectiveness, and we as an observer shouldn't bring our subjectiveness into it. We should just describe and measure the objective reality. Yeah? But that indicates that you need to be okay with that. Basically, these people then thought, okay, reality is objective and it has a certain nature, yeah, an objective nature, and we can measure it. That's the Age of Enlightenment, basically. Leading to the scientific revolution in Europe, which is 650, it's a main part of this Age of Enlightenment. So that then, you could say, led to the dominance of causal analytic philosophical approach in Europe. And from there, spread to all over the world in the end. Yeah, but it's essential to understand why we have this, or why we had this Age of Enlightenment. This is very important to understand. That's why with all the points I said earlier, led to that time, and that's why we have today such a strong dominance of causal analytic approach, philosophy. So again, the development we have here shows how we develop in Europe a dominance of causal analytic philosophical approach, and this approach we know spread then throughout the world, also to China in the end. And let's have a look now what happened in China. So we have here our next little chapter. Important historic events in China influencing Chinese medicine. The origin of the classical Chinese medicine lies in Taoist philosophy. And the origins of Taoist philosophy probably lies in nature observation, in connection with nature, and in also a kind of worship of nature, without a concept of divine creation, which is very important to understand. Because when we are in a Western sense, we are thinking causal analytically, we always need a cause for an event. And in a Taoist philosophy, you don't need a cause for an event, because there's a certain way to develop a certain insight to it, which we will gonna talk about a lot in the second video. Not the questions answered, but the second main course video. So the one you will get next month. So, but there are the origins for the Taoist philosophy in observing nature. You probably could say that any culture that lives very directly in connection with natural environments will tend to develop a conditional thinking. Because if you feel the influences of your environment directly to you, you more think or more understand or feel that you are existing because there are conditions. Yeah? And the more a society can get the impression it's disconnected from its individual environment because it can compensate for environmental changes, then you will have a more causal analytical thinking. Yeah? Giving you an example, for example, if you have a year and the season, let's say the summer was too wet and all the potatoes you tried to grow were rotting. So in that moment, you wouldn't have enough potatoes in the shops. You would directly feel your climate, your weather, you would feel it, you would connect to it because you would see it and you would be affected by it because you couldn't buy any potatoes. You would need to interest yourself, what else is there? Because maybe in that summer the potatoes didn't grow very good, but other vegetables grew because they more like the wetness. So you would notice the connections from the environment by your food possibilities. But if your society can compensate for that by, let's say, very complex trade, the consumer wouldn't even notice that this was a bad year for potatoes, let's say, in that specific country, because the shops would be full of potatoes, because the country could compensate by trade for these ups and downs in climate or in season or weather. So because of the efficiency of the society, people get the impression they're more independent from the environment, which is not true, but it's an impression we get. That's why people, for example, tend to lose today the understanding of food as a connective aspect to your environment, but see food more as a supply for nutrients. But in the end, not the nutrients are the important aspect that you consume and that you have them, but the process stimulated by it is what is important. That's what we are alive of. So, yeah. So we eat food from our environment, and with that we connect and adapt to the environment. So if we basically would only eat food, let's say from artificial environments, like from super effective greenhouses with heating and pressure control, we wouldn't use the food anymore as a connective aspect to the environment. Hopefully we will still breathe our environment, so we're still connected that way. We are born into a certain environment, but we would lose one major key to our environment. And that could lead to being then having more allergies, to have metabolic weaknesses and sorts like that. Because very normal, because we need to exchange with our environment on many levels, on breathing, eating, being born there, emotionally and everything. And if we don't use one of the key aspects to interact with the environment, like the food, we develop certain kind of diseases. And that's why many diseases today are a result of that already. Yeah, so that's why, obviously, Chinese medicine, one key statement is always that you should eat more seasonal and regional, obviously. But the answer, the reason why behind it, is because Chinese medicine describes human, as I said before, with the conditions and sees the connection from the conditions to the process. So the eating of regional and seasonal is a very, very important aspect for your process development. Yeah. I came to that now because we're talking about the Taoist philosophy aspects, background, and me saying that probably any culture living more direct under the influences of their conditions would think more in a more conditional way of thinking. And Taoist philosophy is a conditional philosophy. And the more a society compensates for environmental swings, it would get the impression to be more independent from an environment, which is, as I said, not true. It's just it's a dependence, independence. What is actually creating certain adaptation problems and creating other problems. So there needs to be a balance there. Yeah. So, but because cultures at some point in their history had this connection to the environment, I'm just saying that probably all cultures had concepts like the Chinese. Yeah? So it's just that the Chinese kind of preserved them longer than other countries or other areas. Yeah. That's why we talked earlier, from when we talked about the European history, about the old Greek philosophy. They also had a more connectiveness to the environment, and that's why I came up with the conditional aspect they had. So anyway, then one of the most famous Taoist philosophers is Lao Tzu, and he was like about the 6th century BC, and he kind of formed a conditional concept. That's at least we think he did, because it's very little known about him. But there's a book which is called the Daodejing, and this is supposed to be written by Lao Tzu. And in the end, I think just the first chapter of this book is the main important chapter in the whole book, because all the other chapters basically build on that first chapter. But the first chapter describes basically, in the end, it describes the foundations of classical Chinese medicine. And we will talk about that later, obviously. So we had him, we had Lao Tzu, we had him kind of, let's say, it was there a time where we had a strong Taoist philosophy in China. And that philosophy, the Taoist philosophy, with its connection to the real environment, was more conditionally than anyway. And yeah, then there was Confucius, 5th century BC, and he was kind of interesting because the changes in Chinese philosophy didn't happen just in the Cultural Revolution. They started really, really early as well. But like we had Heraclit and Aristotle in Greek times, they also were there at the same time. The concept was there at the same time, and they was no decision to be made between one of them. And probably that was slightly a bit with Taoist philosophy and developing causal analytic philosophies in China. And Confucius, in him developing these teachings of order, that was a causal analytic aspect or movement. Confucius tried to make the state more efficient. That's why he noticed what Lao Tzu even wrote in his book, because Lao Tzu wrote, if the wise men would rule, the state will fall into chaos. It sounds like a silly thing to say, because you would probably think it would be nice if someone wise would rule. But what he meant with that was, he means with wisdom, he means that you would see many factors, that you don't decide between black and white, that you have many truths possible. But if you want to rule a country, you need to decide between black and white. You need to decide between go that way or go that way. So a country ruler needs to be having an agenda. He needs to decide between aspects. And that's why Lao Tzu said, if a wise man would rule, he would have many tools, the country would follow case because he wouldn't come up with a causal development. That's why in that idea of Lao Tzu, the wise man would he would like help the ruler. He would advise, but he wouldn't rule. And Confucius, he obviously noticed the weakness of such a strong Taoist philosophy, many truths philosophy. He probably noticed the weakness in a country ruling efficiency. So he tried to get more causal analytic to make things more efficient. That's why, but to do that, he had to basically disconnect yin and yang a bit. Because we talk about yin and yang in the second video really in depth, but the main idea, to take this before already, of yin and yang is this, that they exist at the same time on the same level. So yin and yang stands for being and not being, stands for disconnection and connection. And it's only existing at the same time. So there's no being without not being from the Taoist point of view. We are more used, in the Western sense, we are more used to think about as either being or not being. But from the Chinese point of view, it's at the same time. But we come to that. It's just I just need that to bring it in quick here, because Confucius took that a bit apart. He disconnected yin and yang. He kind of divided yin and yang, which is not in a Taoistic philosophy correct, obviously, but he needed it, or he did it, to make the state more efficient. So he would divide the people. He would say, this is ruling people, this is serving people. He would even divide men and women. He would divide certain hierarchies. He created such a social hierarchy pyramid thingy. And funny enough, he didn't actually achieve a lot in that time, but later his teaching were used much more. But anyway, it is one important step in Chinese history where you see development of causal analytic philosophy. But it existed in the ancient times coexisting with the conditional philosophy, the Taoist philosophy. That's why, funny enough, today people in China would say that they have two main philosophies: the Taoist philosophy and the Confucianistic philosophy. They are quite very opposite in the end, as concerning yin and yang. So the height of Taoism was probably in the 4th century BC in China, but there it already had very much a religion. A religious form. That is a difference again from the clean philosophy of Taoism. And we don't want to go into it too much now, but the main difference is again that in the religion form of Taoism there is already a disconnection again. Defined between the now and the then, and the hierarchy and the life and death even. So there are certain connections, certain disconnections, what divided the main yin and yang concept. So that was in some way the height of that philosophy, but in a very realistic form. Then we have a very much important aspect to understand about Chinese history is the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty, like from 1368 to 1644, was a dynasty what isolated China from the Western world. There are many interesting stories about it, but why is it important for us? For us, it's important to understand that because China in the Ming Dynasty isolated China from the Western world, it maintained the conditional concepts longer. It's a speculation, obviously, but if the Ming Dynasty wouldn't have isolated China from the rest of the world, the Western influences, and remember what we talked about in that time when the Western influences would have probably earlier came into China and probably earlier connected China to the causal analytic development what Europe was on about. Yeah. So in China today, the Ming Dynasty officially is often seen as a bad time, not in the sense of culture and everything, but in the sense of this isolation. They said, oh, there we got the time where we kind of got behind it all. Yeah, of course, we were we were stagnant a bit. That's probably true when you look at it from perspective of economic development in relation to the West. But if you look at it from preserving certain cultural and philosophical aspects, it was a very important area. Again, we probably wouldn't have had so much Taoistic aspects today anymore. But the Ming Dynasty ended in 1644 with the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, and that dynasty was not Chinese actually, because there were a Manchu dynasty that was a completely different culture coming from the north, and they had different traditions, they were completely different people. They were just in that time, because the Ming Dynasty, they were because of internal decadence, you could say. Yeah, this is a problem often with when things are stable, people start to not appreciate the stability. I once said in a class that stability, and too much stability also creates fear, because stability disconnects from development or change, and that's why the more stable a system is, the more fear it develops in relation to the outside, because that's the unknown. That's why decadence develops. So decadence is often a reaction to fear, and the fear develops due to too much stability and fear of the unknown. But that's clinically important at some point. But so the Ming Dynasty broke down through internal decadence and was then an easy target for more ambitious cultures, which were the Manchus then, and they didn't have the cultural background and not the. It's slightly, you could compare. It's not as much, but you could compare it a bit with the fall of the Roman Empire, and then the northern European tribes suddenly sitting on the throne in Rome and didn't know how to run things. They could just open the tap, but they couldn't build one. Yeah, you know what I mean. And that was a bit the same thing in China. The Manchu people, they're sitting then on the throne and they're just letting things run, but they actually liked what they saw, but they couldn't create it because they were not as they came from a completely different development. So the important fact here is that because of the Manchu dynasty was just going on to it, but they couldn't hold up the standards of social dynamics in anything, in education, in trade. They were basically not educated enough, or not in the sense what was used there. They were educated in other ways, obviously, but that didn't fit the Chinese requirements. So we had basically these dynasty, but was also then in that sense weak in a way, not in a martial way, but in a philosophical way. And the end of the Ming Dynasty also then basically caused the opening of China. So China was suddenly open to the Western world. And that had various cultural, political, and philosophical influences. So everything suddenly came like a flood from the West, like religions and missionaries and everything. People that wanted to trade and people that wanted to get influence. That led then to the Opium Wars, 1839 and 1856, where basically the Opium Wars was a power struggle between China and the Western countries for dominance in Chinese affairs. And because they were lost by the Chinese, that led to the so-called Unequal Treaties. These were a lot of treaties Western countries formed with countries in Asia, not just China, but also Vietnam and other countries. These unequal treaties were basically treaties that were not fair. So they put China into a situation to have less rights and less possibilities, and basically were exploited by the Western countries. That weakened China. You see you see the line here. So we have the weakening from the end of the Ming Dynasty. Then we had the Manchu Dynasty, which was not strong enough anyway. Then to the opening, the influences, the Opium Wars, the treaties, that all led downhill for China. And that's why when you probably like around, let's say 1890 and 1910, around that time, the youth of China, the people that were interested in stuff, the awake people in that time, they experienced China as politically, cultural, intellectual, and scientifically backwards, behind, weaker in relation to the West. Because the West, they had better weapons and they were stronger and louder and more efficient and whatever. And obviously, people always tend to take more power for more truth sometimes. If someone more powerful, then it's obviously more right, more successful. So the people then in China thought, because the Western countries, they experienced the power of the West through the forces they brought there, military and everything, they didn't like them, but they kind of saw and thought, oh yeah, they're more powerful, so they must have done the right thing in the past, and we didn't. So the Chinese, that's the important point, experienced themselves as weaker and behind development in relation to the West. That led to the main attitude of all the old stuff is bad. To put it really bluntly. And from that point of view, I think you can understand the Cultural Revolution better, where it was really severely like the everything old is bad attitude. But before that, we had in the end of the Qing Dynasty, we had the Xinhai Revolution and the foundation of the Republic of China on the 1st of January 1912 by Sun Yat-sen. And he was educated in the West as well. And I think he was a physician, a Western physician, and he would have developed some kind of state in relation, also in like example of Western countries. But he had a kind of a lung disease, and he died early. And he left then again China in a kind of a power hole, in a absence of power and organization. But it wasn't also the whole Chinese landmass. It was a smaller area. No? Anyway, this Republic of China went down, and but before that, when Sun Yat-sen founded that little republic, he right away made classical Chinese medicine illegal. Yeah? There was a prohibition of Chinese medicine, and not because he was mean, because from his point of view, yeah, remember what I said earlier, these people then, at that time, thought everything old, Chinese old, is bad, because that's why we are so backwards today. So it was understandable from his point of view, and studied in the West, and that he thought obviously he helps China to prohibit Chinese medicine, because it's backwards, it's old, it's ridiculous. And it was ridiculous at some degree at that time, because the Ming Dynasty was basically, the end of the Ming Dynasty also ended the organized education development of classical Chinese medicine. Yeah, Chinese medicine, you could say, went down severely with the end of the Ming Dynasty. So at that state of time where Sun Yat-sen experienced Chinese medical service, it was bad. But not necessarily because of the Chinese medicine itself, just because of the system itself. But from his point of view, he wanted to introduce the Western medicine and establish Western medicine in China as a forward movement. So, yeah, but as you said, he died, and the Republic was down, and then this power vacuum led to the Chinese Civil War. And that was between 1927 and 1949. The Civil War was between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, mainly as the main leaders. Mao Zedong was educated by the Soviet Union, by the Russians. He was basically a communist. And Chiang Kai-shek was kind of influenced by the other Western countries. He wasn't communist, he was more imperialist. And yeah, but you all know how the Civil War ended. It ended with the dominance of Mao Zedong over Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek had to retreat with his rest of the little Republic of China that there was, and his Kuomintang to Formosa, an island, what is today called Taiwan. And 1949, Mao Zedong founded then the the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949 as a communist dictatorship. There's lots to study about this time, Mao Zedong's Civil War time, but just let's say the outcome. And China was then a People's Republic of China, a communist country, where we have, which is obviously a nature of a communist country, we have one truth philosophy. Yeah, because a communist dictatorship is basically that the communist party or the communist idea stands all over the rest, above everything else. Meaning, there's no democracy possible, because democracy has something to do with dividing of power, we said that, yeah? And the ability to understand that there are many truths possible at one moment. But because the communist dictatorship only allowed their truths, yeah, it was a big, massive step away from Taoist or foundations that used in classical Chinese medicine. And that's why the foundations of classical Chinese medicine, which are actually the true essence of classical Chinese medicine in their foundation is the simultaneously of yin and yang, the many truths concept, yeah? The not needing to dividing between wrong and right. That concept was no use for a communist system, because it would basically all the time contradict the communist one truth aspect. Yeah, and that's why Mao Zedong prohibited Chinese medicine right away as well in the beginning, and then realized that because Mao Zedong wanted to basically form China like the then existing Soviet Union, like with a strong metal industry and steel and everything, and Western medicine. But they couldn't develop Western medicine right through the whole country. China is big and lots of rural areas, and to develop proper Western medicine, you need also devices, because it's an objective medicine where you measure things. And to measure, you need equipment and laboratories and X-ray machines and CT and all these things, what comes after. But that wasn't possible in the rural areas, and that's why Mao Zedong was kind of forced to allow Chinese medicine to go on in the mainly of the rural areas to provide a basic medical care. And for a long time, for example, in China, the farmers, they didn't have insurance, health insurance. So I remember when I was in China in the early 90s, even then there was no health insurance for the farmers. So in the poor areas, they had to go to Chinese medicine because they could afford it. They couldn't afford an X-ray or something. And only in the recent times, China created insurances for the farmers. And that's why today in China, Chinese medicine goes even more downhill, because it was before when the farmers were using it or they were depending on it. This dependence went away, so it's the struggle to survive for Chinese medicine in China is even more severe these days because of the insurances. So Mao Zedong allowed Chinese medicine, but it was obviously conflicting with the communist doctrine very much, severely, because the whole point in Chinese medicine, I say again, is the many truths concept, and communism is a one truth concept. It's very contradictory. So Mao Zedong had to change Chinese medicine, adapting it to communism a bit. So that didn't just go for the Chinese medicine. It was something about art and other cultural aspects. That's why it led to the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976. So, and the severeness of it, we understand because we now know that the people before experienced themselves so much as a failure in relation to the Western countries. That's why the hate, let's say, use that word, for the old was so strong. Mao kind of there's this ancient story of the first emperor in China, the first emperor that connected the different parts of China and started the wall building, everything. And this guy is supposed to killed a few thousand of teachers and academics to show how his position is not so much stronger. And Mao, in some speech at some point, bragged about how this Qin emperor killed a few thousand of academics, but he killed loads more. So he kind of was bragging how efficient and cool he is in even outdone this brutal Qing emperor. Not trying to say how brutal it is, but trying to tell his people how good he is actually to get rid of the bad old, yeah, and to bring China into a glorious future. And yeah, that's why he could kind of say to the students in that time, to the young people, look, turn around and everything above 30 is suspicious, except him, of course. But yeah, that was basically the thing in the Cultural Revolution. Everyone above, yeah, over the age of 30 is suspicious, because it could be too old, infected with old ideas. So we had the strong Cultural Revolution, and then it led to a radical rejection of classical concepts in all areas of life, yeah, especially in philosophy and medicine. But yeah, we could go on for ages what happened out there, but that can be part of your homework, that you look a bit what happened in the Cultural Revolution in China. Yeah, and you can look what happened to the martial arts, what happened to opera, what happened to poetry, the many aspects of life. Yeah, that led to the writing reform in China in 1956, because the thing is, the Chinese character, I don't want to go too much into it, but maybe that's another point, but the Chinese character and the Chinese way of writing and even speaking is very much a conditional way. We have a very different concept of writing and speaking, but the writing system is a conditional system. When we combine two words, for example, we create a combined meaning. Yeah, but the Chinese combine two symbols and create a third meaning. Yeah, that's what happens. So let's say the symbol for sun, and there's a symbol for field. Yeah, when you put that together, you don't have sun field. You have man, yeah, as in male. So you see, you have one meaning, a second meaning, and they don't combine. They create a third meaning. That's how in a nutshell, this writing system works. So it's a conditional way. So you need to have a certain meaning. You have to put the writing in relation to conditions. So not within the character itself, but also within the external conditions. So you could say a certain character in relation to that kind of life, let's say in relation to bakery or eating, cooking, has a meaning, but in relation to something else in life, let's say to medicine, it has a different meaning. That makes Chinese language so complicated for us, because you have always to put characters into relation to something to understand it. And that's why the Chinese in the old days couldn't read just any text, even if they could read. Yeah? So let's say a farmer, let's say, could read. He couldn't read a text written by, let's say, a scholar talking about astrology, for example. Yeah, because the farmer, it just wasn't his field of expertise. So he could see the characters, but they would have he could only get a certain meaning of it, or even a wrong meaning, because he couldn't bring it into the right relation. Yeah, there we have the conditional aspect again. And that's why every area of expertise could only read their own texts, because the text only made sense in relation to its framework. Yeah, we are more used to that we write something, we have a defined language in a sense of definition. So we could or we bring out a text out of relation in a certain way and still read it. But that wasn't the case with Chinese characters. And so Mao used that and saying, look, the old people, they withheld wisdom from you workers and farmers, yeah, and it was kind of like so it was held away from you, keep you stupid. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the writing system so everyone can read it. Yeah? So from the point of view of that time and the people, it was actually a reform, a positive thing. Say, oh, well, great. Yeah, I can read stuff now about anything I'm interested in. But you could have done in a way before. You would have needed to also work with the aspect you're interested in order to understand the writing. And that obviously didn't work in the imperial times because there were all these social disconnections done by Confucius again. So very complicated situation. But just saying that in changing the writing system, Mao changed the conditional aspects of the writing a lot. So he just didn't make it possible that everyone can read it. In order to do so, he had to define a certain meaning. So in Mao's times, the writing reform made a simplification of Chinese characters, less conditional. Yeah, they standardized the sounds even and defined the interpretation. So in doing so, they made the text, any text, in libraries obviously more available to the masses, but at the same time dictated what the masses actually read. Because in order to do that with that kind of language, you have to define it more and create a general way of definition of interpretation. So Mao made the changes in the writing system. The masses could suddenly read the text they're interested in, going to the library, but they basically got a predefined interpretation. They actually didn't read the classical text, that's what I'm saying. Yeah? So if you want to read a classical text, it's written in Old Chinese, you can only read it in connection with doing that topic and having a mentor who helps you with that. Yeah? If you just get a book from classical Chinese text today and you maybe speak Chinese or read Chinese, you couldn't read it just like that. But if you take a book from the modern time in China, like anything after, let's say, 1960, you would have the different Chinese writing system already. Yeah, with dots and commas and with a different way to write and the simplification of the characters. So then you could read it with a general knowledge of Chinese reading, because the meaning is defined. So that is, in one hand, it's a reform of the Chinese writing system. On the other hand, it hid meanings, obviously. So, yeah, so then you had like publications of new versions of classical text with defined interpretations, and especially these Taoistic, philosophical, and classical medical text. So that way, the communist people could keep Chinese medicine, because they needed it for the rural areas, as I said earlier. At the same time, change the concept so they would go along with communist ideas. Yeah, they wouldn't contradict each other. So they had to change the classical text in changing the language. That was a coup done here. It's a massive coup, actually. It's amazing, but done there. Yeah. So standardization, simplification, systematization, and physiological political adaptation of very complex classical medical concepts led then also to the final result in creating so-called traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. So the outcome from this changing of the medical text was traditional Chinese medicine. So traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, is very young. It's developed, as I said, between the 50s and the 80s in China. And used classical aspects, but changed the foundations. So the real classical foundations are gone in China, in TCM. And this TCM then was nationally and internationally presented as the official and only version of the Chinese, of the old medicine. And it was officially in China is equal to Western medicine, which is actually not the case, because there's many reasons. In China, you have actually to study Western medicine, and then you can do a further education into TCM if you want. So but your foundation is Western medicine. But that's fine in China, because in the changing of the classical text, they discarded the classical foundations anyway and exchanged them for Western foundations. So that's why you can today in China study TCM as a further education of Western medicine, because it has now the same foundation. But obviously, with changing the foundations of Chinese medicine, you change the possibilities of it. So that's a very complex aspect, and we're gonna into the changes, what the communists changed in Chinese medicine foundations. We're gonna into that very detailed in also the next chapter, the next video. And that might even put things then in a better perspective. But ending our talk about the historic events, we had the development, what we just talked about, and then we had in 1978 the Chinese reform, again, a bit mild reform in direction of opening China to the outside again a bit. And it was Deng Xiaoping, he kind of eased a bit in China, made the connection to the Western world again more possible. And that way, the interest of the Western people for Chinese medicine could be also supported, and many people more people could then study Chinese medicine. Obviously, the modern version of it, the communist version of it. And so from then on, it developed further. And the situation in China changes all the time, and there's not hard to know what happens. But in the moment, Chinese medicine is still going downhill, especially acupuncture as a technique. And there's less interest also within the Chinese society in Chinese medicine. So it's nearly seen a exotic aspect in China. So many young people don't go to Chinese medicine a lot; they go to Western medicine, and they need to have a certain connection to it, maybe some in the family or something, or have to have other connections to it. But it's diminishing a lot in China. And I have a friend in China, for example, he's a Kung Fu and Qigong master. He's teaching Qigong, and he tried to help schools with Qigong and Kung Fu because people gain weight now. A lot of children, they don't eat so good anymore, and they develop all the metabolic diseases we know in the West as well. And he tried to convince a school board that he can teach the children some Kung Fu, so they lose weight and are more fit and everything. And they said they're not interested because he's teaching some old stuff, and he shouldn't teach Kung Fu, is too old and backwards, and he should come up with something new and clever. And so he ended up coming back with a new concept and just called it gymnastics from Germany, he called it. And they liked that. They were happy about that because Germany, they connect with Volkswagen and BMW and stuff, and that gymnastic must be good. And so it's very weird. But he's teaching actually Kung Fu, just under a different name now, to get it connected to the people. So it's funny stuff, actually. Okay, I leave you with that today. And we did a bit longer than 90 minutes, but it doesn't matter because it's the first video and it's quite, you can't really stop it there in the middle. Yeah, that's the first chapter of the 24-module online education. I hope you had fun with it as well and found some interesting ideas. Well, that's just the pretext, obviously, because we didn't even start with the foundations of classical Chinese medicine. We talked about the backgrounds, but as I said earlier, it's very important that we cover these things. Because we need to bring things into perspective. So next time we're gonna have a bit of talk about the development of TCM again. We need to work out a bit what is basically the difference of TCM in classical Chinese medicine, so that we can then really charge into the main topic and develop the foundations of classical Chinese medicine to develop the system up again. And yeah, that will be a very interesting challenge. And your homework would be to, as I said earlier, to go a bit more into the historic aspects, maybe look a bit into the Cultural Revolution, what changed there, maybe have a look in the change of the writing system, that you get an idea what actually happened. And yeah, I hope you made some notes. And if you have questions, then if you are a basic member, then just send the questions and they will be addressed in the questions answers video. So they're more general then, so because I collect all the questions there. And the Premium Plus members, they obviously can use the Facebook support group where I directly answer questions, and the Premium Plus people obviously can ask me directly on Skype. So yes, then yeah, I'm happy we did that, and I'm looking forward to doing the next video. And yeah, goodbye for today, and have a good time, be safe, and till next time. Thank you.